While most of the world and certainly the majority of the American media is focused on the Israeli, now Iranian conflict and all that's going on with that, with the huge missile barrage last night, it's hard to pay attention, but it's also important to remember that there is another war going on, one that we've covered a lot here with Russia and Ukraine. And even though it's off the headlines, a lot of things are still going on. And we thought it was important to kind of break contact from the Israeli situation right now, although that one's probably just in the latter stages of waiting for the next explosion. We'll get back to that one in a little while. But first of all, I want to bring you up to date on what's happening on the ground in Russia. It's been a while since I've done that. And we have the excellent Matthew Ho to help us unpack a lot of this stuff and try to make some sense out of what we do see there. And we're both on the tactical and on the strategic and political realm. So first of all, Matt, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Danny, thank you for having me back on.
Always a pleasure to have you on and get some no kidding, no nonsense views on things and really dig down into the deeper. I want to start off, first of all, with a piece that's in the Washington Post because it's noteworthy in one respect that it's getting public notice that things are not going well for the Ukraine side. And according to the headline there, you see that the East is buckling under improved Russian tactics and superior firepower. And I think that's more important. And I want to show some of the things and kind of get your view on these as a combat veteran yourself as to what the development, the evolution that you've seen on the Russian side, whether we have or haven't seen it on the Ukraine side, and then what the implications are going forward. And so the first area I want to look at is probably the most recent significant change, and that is the city of Vuhledar in the southeast southeast of Ukraine. Something that Russia has been trying for a year and 8 months to subdue. This is probably the longest battle that we've seen in this entire conflict so far. And Russia has put enormous amounts of effort into it. I want to say that they have had 5 separate attempts to crack this nut, and they finally did it. Now I want to pull a map up here and kind of show what's been going on with that. So here's of course your big map. Wait a minute, I'm not sure I actually did that right. Where are you at? Are you seeing the map?
You got me on the screen, so I don't think you did it right.
I didn't do it right. All right. Well, I could see it, and why couldn't y'all? Oh, okay. There's a reason for that. So here we go. That's a little bit better. All right. So here's the main battlefront we've been seeing for a couple of years now. Vuhledar is down here in the south, and that's important for a number of reasons. But I want to zero in here because it's going to really show, kind of why things are going the way they are. And how the change tactics have come in there. If I can find it on the map, that
it's in the south of Donetsk.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Not in the south of Ukraine, the south of Donetsk Oblast or province.
Okay. And so here's this is kind of where it is. It's kind of in the southern part of the Eastern Front. And I want to show you here. So the terrain around here is very, very hilly and difficult. There has been, and I'll zoom in on the city itself here. It's basically a citadel, but there's lots of tall buildings. And the Ukraine side has just done phenomenal at defending the city from frontal attack, from some flank attacks that Russia's been doing for a long time. But what they did finally, and you're going to see this I'm going to give you some examples elsewhere here in a minute, but they decided to say, hey, how about instead of hitting our head against a brick wall and just trying to come here and here, which plays all to the strength of the defense, we just bypassed the thing. So they started moving here in the north and then here in the south and taking all of this, and you can see that they took some of these things field by field, some of these little squares. Right. I mean, they were fighting over individual squares of these of this forested area and the forest belts in between of the farmland, et cetera. And so what they did is methodically moved up here until they were cutting the lines of the road networks in there so that they interdicted and took into fire control the routes that would bring in either resupplies or personnel and take wounded personnel out, et cetera, so that it became untenable. And then they finally just moved into the back part and surrounded the whole thing. And once they had it surrounded and no one could come in or leave, then it was literally just a matter of time before these guys ran out of ammunition, food, and water. Right. And apparently, according to CNN, this actually fell yesterday. So I just wonder, first of all, Matt, if you can just kind of give me, because I know you know something about this battle here, What does this tell you about what Russia had been doing and what they finally started doing?
Well, I think the cost to them early in the war, in the first year or so, particularly say highlighted the what about 4 month long battle for Bakhmut, and Vuhledar has been. I mean, after Bakhmut was taken by the Russians in April of '03, if I remember correctly, this was one of the cities that was next. I mean, so this is how long we've heard about this location for. And well, what that means then is that becomes a political it becomes a political objective as much as it's a tactical, operational, or strategic objective. And so this is maybe why you see, particularly even on the defensive side, the Ukrainians holding on for positions longer than they should, right? Rather than falling back, preparing positions to fall back to, the political significance of these towns, because they are known by the West. People in the United States know this town in Ukraine, like we've heard of so many other towns, and we learn new ones, right? As the front moves farther west, or even during Ukraine's offensive last summer, we learned towns we never heard of. Not even towns; they were hamlets, really. But the political significance of the weight that Westerners, people in the U.S., the Brits, our politicians, our media, knowing the names of these places, what that means then for the Ukrainians is that their hands are tied, and they're not maybe as flexible in their defense as they should be. For the Russians, I think what we've seen, the difference is, say, compared to 18 months ago with Bakhmut, the willingness to commit large number of troops in what essentially are frontal assaults, as opposed to trying to flank, as you were describing, Danny, flank these positions, flank these built up areas, rather than going right into them. And so that's an evolution I think we would have seen naturally. But I think when you compare how the Ukrainians are tied to these cities, these towns, these villages, every time they lose one, it's a major headline in the West, as compared to how the Russians have been able to be much more flexible. I mean, and you've even seen it in the way that they operate tactically. The way the Russians, I don't even know what you would call their guys on motorbikes and on ATVs that we see footage of. I mean, that's not even a team. It's two dudes on two bikes. I don't even know what the tactical, the unit symbol for that would be, right?
Right.
But so we've seen the Russians willing to adapt and to make trade-offs in how they conduct this war, based upon the reality as it's presented to them, while the Ukrainians remain tied most to a political narrative of this war that they can't lose, they can't be defeated, they can't retreat, and that's hurt them in ways that are growing and growing. You can imagine that this war will be different in the sense that if the Ukrainians had a much more flexible defense in depth, and they were willing to trade land for eating up the Russians as they came forward, you could see how this could potentially be a different circumstance. Now, overall, it'd still be the same. You still have this essentially status quo, this type of conflict where neither side can knock each other out, that type of thing. But it would be, certainly the Ukrainians would be in a better space if they weren't so tied to this narrative of not being defeated, not losing, in any of their defeats then becoming major headlines.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, I think that's been a fictitious trade-off from the beginning, because I don't think that it is going to be a static situation, and that they, even if they had better tactics, that they could have changed the outcome. I think that the attritional nature of the battle and the gross advantage that the Russians have in manpower and firepower and in industrial capacity is just too big to overcome, no matter what the West did or didn't do. And one of the reasons why this has been so grievous to me is that the end is ordained really from the very beginning, and to ignore that and to continue to pretend otherwise, like you're talking about in a microcosm on some of these individual battles, like Vuhledar, like Bakhmut, like Avdiivka, is the kind of a bigger picture too, that they keep getting men blown up and killed, and there's no possibility of reversing what we see here.
Right. And how many are they sacrificing? How many are they giving up that could be used later, right? So like Bakhmut, I think was a great example a year and a half ago, where Bakhmut was going to fall eventually. And if you hold on, if you give up Bakhmut in January, okay, what do you get in return in terms of the brigades that you don't have destroyed, defending what is essentially going to be a defeat for you? And everyone could see that coming. Everyone except, I think, those who are the strongest proponents of the war and those who are on Twitter posting Bakhmut stands or whatever they were posting back then. I mean, so you get in this position where what's the smarter thing to do here? And it's the smarter thing to do to not commit your troops to a fixed position that will eventually be degraded and wore down, or in the case of Vuhledar, we're seeing, basically flanked, as the Russians have been doing more and more, so that now your guys are cut off, and best case for them is that they're able to squirt out and escape. And of course, worst case being the opposite.
And now I want to go back to the map here and saw, because now there's something kind of on a bigger issue that's at the decision that's made by the senior leaders, whether that's Zelensky, whether that's Sersky, whether it was Zelensky before, et cetera. And that is in the battles that they choose to fight and what their objective is. Now, we've been talking a lot about the Kursk offensive, and I just want to zero in on that. So on this map here, just for everybody's recollection, when you see these red symbols, that's a Russian assault or a Russian drone strike, and the blue ones are Ukrainian strikes, etc. But that, just trying to ignore those. The thing I want you to zero in on is that all this red area is where the Russians are. The light red area, like here, that's a recent gain by the Russians. And for our folks who've been watching this from the beginning, this is I think one of the more recent, anyway, egregious strategic errors by the Ukrainian side, because they had this operation which they claimed was to draw Russian forces away from the east to make that easier for them to fight. But you see that this right here continues to shrink, and Russia continues to make these penetrations in here. With it appears that they're trying to just drive across the neck of this bulge here, so that they will eventually trap all the people in here. And then instead of having to fight their way like from the top and destroy everyone, if they move through this area here, they basically cut them off, and then will force them either to withdraw or to be destroyed, as did happen in Vuhledar, by the way. They had the same thing where they almost had them surrounded, and they had a chance to withdraw, and they refused to do it. And from what I read on the Telegram channels, the Ukrainian leadership refused to give permission for them to withdraw. So now then they lost them all. And there's a similar situation brewing here. But what you see, Matt, and this is what I want you to talk about, is that this whole foray continues to just eat up all kinds of equipment, manpower, logistics, everything else, just to maintain this part right here. But this is, they were a little bit further from this, from about the 7th or 8th day in, and it never went any further. So why do they stay there now?
It's perplexing, Danny. I mean, I think we've talked about this before. Certainly, I see the Kursk operation as a political stunt. Right? It was a political mover, get our people into Russia, be able to trumpet that around the world. Zelensky is going to go to the United Nations with his victory plan. The Americans and the Brits and everyone are going to say, "Oh yes, look at those Ukrainians. Look how plucky and how strong they are, and they're not giving up. And look, they invaded Russia. We have to support them. They've got this victory plan, And we saw how that played out. And now you've got these troops that were committed to this demonstration, this stunt, there. And just as you described, they're slowly getting cut off. The Russians are in no hurry to do it because they don't need to be in a hurry. I don't think we've ever in history, I don't know if ever in history we've seen a country react so nonchalantly to their territory being invaded as we've seen the Russians here, because they knew there was no significance in there. There was no importance in this. Everything was just, this was all geared for Western headlines. It wasn't meant to accomplish anything operationally, strategically. It couldn't accomplish anything operationally or strategically. So now you've got, I don't know what the current estimate of the Ukrainian force is there, but say it's about 10,000 still. You've got 10,000 of what supposedly your best, most experienced, well-trained and equipped troops stuck in Russia, just getting bled out, and the Russians are taking their time slowly isolating them and wrapping them up. And then, so why they're not withdrawing now, particularly after the United Nations, the victory plan, Zelensky's signing of artillery shells with Governor Shapiro, since that's all done and over with and failed pretty much, why they're not withdrawing their forces. And I think it's just this pigheadedness, this stubbornness, this political cravenness that it's better to lose our men, better have our men in this meat grinder than to lose face.
And, and I just got to wonder, how much longer can that continue on? And let me show you again, we can run back to the map here to show you what the significance and the ramifications of doing what you just said are. So here's your Kursk salient. Now I'm going to come down here and we're again going to see some issues on the change of tactics. So this is the Pokrovsk front here, and you can see that they continue to inch closer and closer to the city of Pokrovsk. And by the way, this blue is basically the range of artillery. So now then the Russians are close enough to where they can take the entire city and all of the roads and the rail networks coming in and out under fire control. So that means that already the utility of having Pokrovsk, because of its communications and its lateral networks that can support the Ukraine side and all of these other areas on the left and right. Now that's already significantly diminished, even without Russia having had physically taken it. One of the more difficult parts of this has been the town of Selidova. This area right here, and the Ukraine side has done a very, very good job of defending this. And for a while, Russia was trying to just continue to go in here and pound into it, as they had done in a lot of these areas as they'd moved through here. But the defense stiffened up here. Well, now then they have said, okay, fine, we'll just go around it. So then they're starting to move north of it. And you see these recent gains here, these light pink areas represent moves in the last 24 hours. So now then they're trying to move in the southern part of the city and around it to, again, cut it off. And they're going to be faced with this pocket to where they're not going to be able to sustain the troops that they have in there. And again, they'll either have to lose them all like they did in Vuhledar or pull them out. And if that sounds familiar, this is what we've been showing for the past several weeks, actually, this pocket here, which continues to slowly shut. And the Ukraine side has already lost all this. It was actually back here when we first started talking about it. And many of them now actually have withdrawn from here. But in light, Matt, of all the stuff, the troops that they had were diverted to the Kursk section, just imagine if they had those to reinforce this area of Selidova, instead of having diverted people from these areas to go fight up there.
And it's, Danny, as we know, it's just not the say it's 10,000 infantry or whatever. It's all the support, right? So what commitment of drones, what commitment of intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance assets, what commitment of artillery, what commitment of HIMARS and so forth have all been put into that Kursk, that Kursk incursion, as well as then just all the support, all the logistics, all the trucks and all the fuel tankers and all the everything that needs to go up there to support those guys, that could have been utilized in the East. So it's much larger than just essentially 3 brigades of troops up there. It's that, as well as the focus. And so I think they went into Russia, like around August 7th. So for
August 6th,
essentially 6 weeks now, the main effort, maybe it's backed off in the last couple of weeks, but say for a month, the main effort of the Ukrainian armed forces was Kursk. That was their main effort. So everything that they had, everything that was in general support of the Ukrainian army was directed up there and not to the east. And so the guys in the east were holding on. Things were bad. And then now they start losing all their general support. And all the attention is focused on the north. And guess what, guys? You guys are on the priority right now. Even though there's still a couple 100,000 Russians pushing on you at a harder and faster rate than you've seen before, you guys are on the priority. So this Kursk thing was a disaster. I was willing to give it the benefit of the doubt because of the political significance of it. And if Zelensky had gone to New York last week and to DC, and he had come back with, that we're going to fire storm shadows and attack them into Russia. And we're also going to give you the extended range JASM. And don't worry, in a few months, we'll talk about Tomahawks to you, as well as, guess what? We're winding up another $75 billion here in the U.S. Congress for you, Volodymyr. Then it would have paid off. But it certainly did not occur like that.
And yeah, that was always a fantasy. I think that they could ever have it. But you know where the fantasy doesn't stop on the ground in Ukraine. It doesn't stop even in Kiev. Let's look over to Brussels, because we've got now Jens Stoltenberg has finally passed the torch on to a new boss. I think his name is Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General. But you see the new NATO boss is a lot like the old one, because he's just repeating the same things that Jens Stoltenberg did. That, yep, we're going to continue to double down. We're going to support Ukraine. We're going to keep on going down this and ignore reality. So what does that tell you about the NATO alliance?
Well, it shows how you get to be the head of NATO. The way you get to be head of NATO is like Stoltenberg was with Norway, and then with Rutte in Holland. You be as pro NATO, you be as pro American empire, you be more hawkish than any of your counterparts. And then when you leave that the prime minister's office, you can slide into a job at NATO. I mean, so Rutte comes out of being the PM of Holland for the last 14 years. I mean, so very important in that sense. But certainly his. We can't expect anything different. I mean, just as you're saying, Danny, here's the new boss, looks like the old boss. I don't think there'll be any difference in attitude, any difference in policy. I think, if anything, God help us, Rutte will be more aggressive than Stoltenberg was, if people can imagine that. Just because he has to prove himself, he has to put his own mark onto NATO. Otherwise, he's just Stoltenberg part 2. Right. So what is he going to do to make NATO his own? What's he going to do to make it in his image? And the only thing you can imagine from this guy is that it's going to be more aggressive. It's going to be more expansionist, and it's going to have a much more global desire. So, of course, Russia gives NATO its reasons for existence now. A few years ago, there were very good conversations about, does NATO have a purpose? With particularly after 2022, those arguments, those conversations have been shut down just because the other side could yell so loud. But Russia, right? So NATO has its purpose because of Russia. Again, no one's questioning that. Many governments in Europe, at the expense of their publics, are increasing not just their defense spending, but also their commitments to NATO. Stoltenberg is on record of calling for increasing NATO militaries by about 70 brigades, which is massive, which talk about fantasy.
Wait. What'd you say?
Yeah, about 2 or 3 months ago, Stoltenberg put out a proposal to increase NATO's combat capacity by about 70 brigades.
70 brigades.
70 brigades. I remember reading this and having to double check that. Yeah, I mean, so you're talking a couple 100,000, right? I mean,
and where's that? Where are those troops going to come from? Who's going to pay for that?
Complete fantasy. But that's what he was putting out to now, because that's what he wanted his legacy to be. And of course, when you have Russia, why can't you ask for that? Why can't you advocate that? And certainly almost all the folks on the television and the newspapers, for the most part, are going to go along with it. Look at Germany right now. I mean, there is a lot of pushback right now with regards to Germany, with regards to the U.S. putting its SM-2 and Tomahawk missiles into Germany. The plan to do that, and then to put the next generation cruise missile into Germany as well, a few years down from now, which is a much longer range missile. And, the German NATO contingent came to the U.S. for the NATO 75th birthday party back in July. And they agreed on a handshake deal with us, with the Americans, without consulting the German public. And there is an uproar now in Germany, and some of the success of the parties like AfD and BSW in Germany, that underpins some of it, this anger overall against the Ukraine war, but also overall against Germany's role in NATO and as part of the American empire. But not as much as you would think. There's not been as much, this idea of we're just going to do whatever we want that the Americans tell us to do, including putting these nuclear armed missiles into our country, which the Russians are going to see as and people old enough to remember what happened when the Pershing IIs went in. I mean, so, what will be the mark, though, that Rutte now has to put on NATO? And so, of course, it's going to remain committed to fighting Russia. That will be its reason for being. The reconquest of the Donbass I think is something that certainly is there for a lot of them. How do we manage ourselves? How do we rearrange ourselves? How do we get to the point where we're able to take back the Donbass, to take back Vuhledar, to take back Donetsk, right?
Dude, you
That
can't even
something
slow
they're
down the
thinking.
move. What are you talking about? Take back? I mean, they haven't even slowed down the first
Hey,
one.
how many crusades did the Christian nations launch that were just ultimately
Oh,
right?
have to
I
go
mean,
there.
it's the same mindset. It's the same mindset. But I think now just to
Nothing
make
new
it
under
even
the
worse,
sun.
Danny, if I could get you more upset, what I think I'm going to say next is that I think where Ruda will make his mark will be making NATO truly global. And it is already global, as people know, but bringing in Japan, bringing in South Korea, and ensuring that a war with China will not just will not be a U.S. versus China war. It will be a NATO versus China war. I think that's where Ruda will make his mark in globalizing NATO. Again, it already is. Ask the Afghan.
Yeah, but the good thing about that is that would make China afraid, and they would back down, and then world peace would break out. So
yeah,
you know,
exactly.
that's
Well,
cool.
yeah.
I mean,
exactly.
I'm sure that's how China would react, isn't it?
I think so.
Anyway.
And then, of course, the Russian people would see that the Chinese back down, so they'd be upset that Putin made this alliance with China, and then they'd overthrow Putin. Yeah, I mean, it's just A, B, and C, Danny. I mean, it's very logical how that would progress. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll talk about A, B, and C, and especially when you start getting into some money. You touched on this a second ago, but to set up this next section here, so Volodymyr Zelensky comes to Washington, D.C. in July for the 75th NATO birthday party, and he's coming in with a lot of high expectations and a lot of fanfare, leaves with nothing. didn't get the offer to join NATO, didn't get even a declaration, certainly not a timestamp on anything which he wanted, didn't get any new offers of any weapons or any money either. So he basically left with some birthday cake, and that's about it. Then he comes back to New York for the United Nations, and he wants even more. Now he wants long-range missiles and more money, and basically he leaves with nothing but a bunch of additional pats on the back. So, and you already mentioned the stuff about how he had, used the whole Kursk offensive to try to stir things up in the media realm to try and generate some excitement, et cetera, to get it. All of that failed. So you would think, okay, maybe you wouldn't, but some people may think that when he goes back home, he's going to, have an appetite suppressant. He's going to realize the cavalry's not coming. There's nobody going to come to rescue me. We better start trying to do something else. But instead, he seems to be going back into the world of, you know what? Let's just keep pretending like everything's okay and everything's going to be fine. And we're just going to bring a lot of top defense companies over and talk about stuff here. Now you see that picture with all these top defense people who would love to get Western money or Ukraine money or anything else and are not concerned about whether this is winnable or losable. And that reminds you, and I don't know if Gary, if you still have it up there, if you can, oh yeah, there it is there.
There we go.
Remember that from December. I wonder if those are the same people around that other table. And you see how eagerly they were smiling here. And put that other one back up, Gary. Let's see that if any of those guys are still smiling. I can't really tell from here. We got the back of their heads, but you can be sure that when they walk out of there with any kind of new contracts that they're going to be happy. But he's just completely remained detached from reality, despite all that stuff I told you on the political and diplomatic realms and the absence of any kind of success, despite all of the losses on the tactical area that we just went through and talked about. Here's what he's saying right now. Gary, if you can roll that tape.
Today, I held meetings with the military leadership. Commander-in-Chief Sursky, Chief of the General Staff Barhilevich, on our brigade's needs on the frontline situation. We discussed the things that our partners can really enhance in the near future. There was a separate report by the Chief of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine Budanov and Minister of Defense Umarov on how our intelligence assesses this year's prospects, Russian intentions, the tasks the Kremlin is setting for their military. We clearly see the main guidelines for what exactly needs to be responded to and in what way. Today, there was also a report by Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal.
Okay, that's good enough right there, Gary. We can run back that. So basically, okay, I got all these dudes in here with a lot of money and actually want to make a lot of money, and we're gonna like make all these cool weapons, and it's gonna be great. And I've looked at the tactical situation. I know what's coming. I know what we need, and my guys told me what we need, and now we got these, and so they're gonna get it. Almost as though it's like, you know what, we're gonna run to Costco and we're gonna get a bunch of bulk stuff to bring here. It should be back later this afternoon. I mean, no matter what anyone thinks about what's happening on the ground, anything that's discussed at that table, that you're talking years before it actually manifested anything on the best of circumstances. So nothing is coming in the near term here. And when you say you know what Russia's doing, well, I mean, you can just look at the military summary channel on open source to figure that out. You don't have to have any intelligence network to figure what Russia's doing. They're pretty open about what they're doing, and they're methodically grinding you to dust. So whether there's a big arrow movement coming, and there's pros and cons to whether there is or isn't, but even if there isn't, the methodical version will eventually just grind them to dust. They just can't fight an attrition war, and yet you see no cognition of that at all.
No, and I think that photo you showed from last year, it may have been then, it may have been earlier in 2023, but Zelensky held the International Defense Armaments something or other. I forget what the name of this thing was that he just held there in Ukraine. And last year, when they held the first of those, the idea was that Ukraine, this is what they said, was going to be the arsenal of democracy. It was going to be the munitions factory of Europe. That's what he promised them. At the same time, too, promising the banks, the Western banks, the city and Wall Street, that you will be able to rebuild our country. So you're talking to Danny about hundreds of billions of dollars here being flaunted in front of these people. If I was Zelensky sitting at that table that you showed, my thing to those defense contractors would be, you've already got tens and tens of billions of dollars in contracts that are lined up, right? And delivery won't occur for years. So if you want that money, you better keep me in power, because the only way you're getting that money, the only way those contracts are being fulfilled, if I'm still in power, if I don't fall. So you better go and tell your congressmen that they need to do everything they can to keep this country afloat. And I think that would be the play he makes, and the same play he makes towards the banks as well, is that you've been promised this reconstruction. People are talking hundreds of billions of dollars coming your way. You know that the only way that occurs is if we don't collapse. The only way you're going to get that money is if you keep me in power. And I think that's the play he makes. That's the pitch he's making, whether he's so clear or so obvious in his wording. I think that's what's being understood. I think what happens with the Ukrainians is, because we did see around July talk about negotiations and talk about, and into August, a willingness to consider something other than victory. And you start hearing this from the Ukrainians themselves. And then what happens is Joe Biden drops out, and all of a sudden the race in the United States is not a foregone conclusion. And so that puts some punch, that gives some life back to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians thinking now, well, hey, it's not guaranteed that Trump wins. And if Harris wins, then we're still in this. Harris has been clear about that, right? And so then Zelensky, this whole victory plan, I'm going to show up, I'm going to campaign for Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania. Right. You saw how well that went down. So I think what we saw also too last week was that when he shows up and he goes to that artillery shell manufacturing plant, and with the Governor Shapiro and Senator Casey, and the response to that in the United States is just outrage. People are, unless you are vote blue no matter who, blue MAGA type of thing, you are upset about that. And I think, so whatever plans Zelensky has there now, he's getting the rug pulled out from under him, because when he gets down to Washington, D.C., yeah, he meets with Biden, he meets with Harris, but no one's really highlighting, the photos and the videos coming out of that, right? So I think they are trying, the Ukrainians in power are trying to hold on to their power because they're corrupt and they know what will happen to them if they lose. I mean, most of them will just abscond to their mansions and their villas anyway. But also, too, I think there are some who believed in the promise that was given to them by the Americans and by the Brits and by NATO back in the late winter and spring of 2022, that we are with you. We are going to help you defeat your historic enemy, to Zelensky. They said, we are going to make you this generation's Churchill. And I think they're still holding on to that. And there's certainly some delusion. If you remember about this time a year ago, Time Magazine had a big cover story about Volodymyr Zelensky, where his own staff, his own inner circle was saying, this guy is delusional. He's messianic. Yep. Now, not much before that, a year before that, he was Time's Man of the Year. So we have to always be humble, right? And how quickly things can turn around.
Change.
But
and,
so I think,
you look at where things are right now. That headline Gary put up there a second ago is a good example of it, because it's touting that they're having this new defense industry, et cetera. Well, about let's see, I want to say it was may have been June, late June, early July.
Yep.
Yeah, there it is. Gary's always on top of that. Things change a lot. Nobody believes Victor like I do, and in fact, none of his people do either.
Well, Danny, there's a good article in the Financial Times yesterday. I can't remember off the top of my head the title or who wrote it, but it's a long article. It's 2,500 words or so that goes into a lot of what we're talking about here, and it goes into the dynamics. And if people are like, Financial Times is a paywall. No, what you do is you download their app and you can read this stuff on the app as long as you're on the app. So I was always concerned about Financial Times too.
I didn't know that.
I just learned that, literally yesterday. So in order to read that article, that's how I learned it. So, download their app and you can read their stuff. But anyway, this article goes into a lot of different things, but it goes into the conflict internal in Ukraine right now. One of the things it points out is that at the beginning of this war, the invasion that begins in 2022, almost 90% of Ukrainians are there will be no talks. There are no negotiations. We are going to win this. And that number is now down to about 55% of Ukrainians, right? So you've seen almost a 35 point drop in the number of Ukrainians who are willing to fight this thing to the end. So you're talking about basically a bare majority. And that number that the Financial Times cited was a poll from May. So they're at 55% 6 months ago, right? So now they're probably much closer to 50%. And we've seen this in other polling too. The Ukrainian public is willing, they see the reality. They know this is an unwinnable war. They're not really sure what the purpose of it is. They understand the history involved of it. They also understand the corruption that's around all of them. And they see their neighbors, their friends, their family getting sent off to get thrown into this furnace for what purposes? Right. To serve who? They understand all that. Yeah. The other side of it, real quick, the other side the Financial Times brought up, though, is that, and they had Ukrainian officials who were saying, we're talking about the end of the war here, in a way that 6 months ago was forbidden to talk about. But they say the problem is that the far right is so powerful, and they have their own militarized forces, that any type of negotiation will be seen by them as betrayal. And in essence, they speak about how that could lead to a coup, to a civil war, etc. So the dynamic within Ukraine is really becoming fractured. Whatever they had 2 years ago in terms of a solid basis among their elite, among their businesses, among their public, whoever, in terms of the way forward with this thing is completely gone. And I think this is something that most of us who are observing this and commenting on said this is what's going to happen. You've got a corrupt government that you're trying to win an unwinnable war, in a war that has a context that is very, very much not a Manichaean good versus evil struggle. Neither side is good here. This thing is bound to fall apart, come undone, over time. And I think that's what we're really clearly seeing internally in Ukraine.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the writing is on the wall, and it's now getting in like Sharpie kind of bold. Yeah. I mean, they don't have enough troops to continue on with this. He left empty-handed after the NATO conference, empty-handed after the UN conference. Nobody has promised any kind of large number of additional, and I'm talking like in the hundreds of artillery pieces, APCs, tanks, etc.
Danny, no one's got them. Right? No one's got them.
Because because most of them are rusting out on the battlefield after the last 2.5 years. No to the long-range weapons, at least from the United States. There's no real hope. And then, as if all that wasn't enough, now that you have this mess going on over in the Middle East, where Israel is now about to expand its war against Iran, And it has already expanded its war against Hezbollah in the southern part of Lebanon, and that's starting to chew them up immediately. They immediately having some bad results there, but that is going to send through the roof their ammunition requirements in many of the same categories that Ukraine is desperately begging for. And I assure you, those are now going to be highly prioritized in Israel. So
you think the Ukrainians are
capacity.
You think the Ukrainians are going to get any Patriot missiles anytime soon? Right?
Yeah.
You know?
Because, man, especially after that strike the other night by Israel, and then Israel is certainly going to strike back. But I saw one report early this morning that the Israeli side in all of their, whether it's Iron Dome, it's the David Sling or the other one, I can't remember the arrow system. Yeah, all that combined, they used up about a year's worth of interceptor missile production.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
1 year, just when that huge barrage there. And Iran has a lot more of those than where it came from, a lot more than two. They can fire. I heard from an expert earlier today that said they have the capacity, if they went on a full-on war, they could launch waves of 100 of these missiles. And there's just not enough interceptor missiles there. So they're all going to Israel right now.
Well, and then too, you have to factor in, and this is one of the reasons, I mean, multiple reasons why I think Iran carried out those strikes yesterday. One of them being is that the value, the utility, the strength of the axis of resistance is in its membership. And so it's seen Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad get degraded over the course of a year of the genocide in Gaza to the point that they probably aren't going to be able to throw too much at Israel. And now that is taking place in Lebanon, where Israel wants to degrade Hezbollah. And so if you're Iran and you're seeing your allies getting degraded like this, you can't let that happen. You know, otherwise you're going to be left standing alone, because after Hezbollah, then they'll move on to Syria or they move on to Yemen, right? You can't let them take you apart piecemeal. So I think that was part of Iran's warning yesterday for them, why they wanted them to back off, even though the risks entailed of like, are we walking into Netanyahu and Israel's trap here? Are we taking their bait by giving them the response that they want to justify to the Americans that we have to come in? And of course, you have seen across the political media landscape in the U.S., full-throated support for the U.S. doing whatever it needs to do, wants to do in the Middle East. Which
right. But here's the point that I want to make. So here's a clip from about 2 weeks ago of Jake Sullivan in Kiev. Now, this is before all the explosions in the Middle East in terms of, this missile stuff. Watch what he says here about interceptor missiles.
Ukraine was running short of air defense interceptors. So I sat down with my team and I said, where are we sending Patriot missiles and AMRAAM missiles around the world in the next 12 months? And I was told there's a whole list of countries we're sending them to. And I said, take every single one of those missiles, every one, and send them to Ukraine. That was not an easy thing to do. It required us to get our allies and partners to come along. Frankly, it required our bureaucracy to come along. And we are currently working on a substantial package, pulling together a range of different capabilities that we are going to try to get out the door before the end of this month.
Okay, and now what? Now that you see that Israel is dying for these same interceptor missiles, what you going to do? You've already robbed Peter. You heard him. He robbed Peter of all these other people that we have promised these missiles to give them to Paul or Vladimir in this case. Now is he going to rob them from Vladimir and give them over to Bibi Netanyahu? I mean, you see where this is going. You don't have them, so you're going to have to take them from somewhere, or you're just not going to have them in the air when you need them, and then neither side is going to have them.
And your point about how quickly can you make these things is so key, Danny. I think people don't understand how long it takes to build these missiles, right? I mean, and the fact that to build another plant to build these missiles and get the workforce and train them to build these missiles is going to take years. And I was trying to look up real quick the production rate for the Patriot in the United States for the interceptors, and it's only a couple dozen a month, I think. And what I did find, as I remember, is that last month or 2 months ago, Japan agreed to increase their Patriot missile production. And this is a big hoopla and Defense News reported that, the Japanese are coming in. They're going to save the day. They're going to, they're going to build more Patriot interceptors. And then you read the details, and Japan is going to increase their production from 60 a year to 100 a year, which, as you said that's how, what, maybe a couple hours worth, you know, at that point, you know, I mean, like if that, I mean, certainly, how many interceptors were fired last night or yesterday by Israel? Hundreds,
and that's on 200 ballistic missiles.
Yeah.
Now imagine if they're going to actually intend to hurt something, and it comes in like 400 or 500 drones first, and you have to have interceptors to shoot all those down. You can't let them go through because of the ammunition. Even though they're easy to shoot down, you still have to use an interceptor to shoot it down. And then they follow up with a couple of waves of 200 or 300 of the ballistic missiles here, and you can see that you're going to run out in no time at all.
Yeah, and of course, you got to add in Iran's allies. So what can the Yemenis throw at this? We've seen what the Yemenis have done consistently, even though they're getting supposedly pounded by the American and British, Air Force and navies. Strike after strike, the largest naval battle since World War II, and the Yemenis haven't missed a step. Right. So how much could Yemen? And they've shown this. They've demonstrated they can do this. They've sent a few drones and a few ballistic missiles to Israel, essentially, I believe, as a warning to let them know we can do this. And the same thing, of course, the Islamic resistance in Iraq and others. They may not have the ballistic missiles like the Iranians or the Yemenis or the Hezbollah has. They certainly have a ton of drones. So you put this all together, and we've still not seen, what Hezbollah will do. They have been firing missiles, but primarily Katyusha type, unguided, shorter range rockets over the last week into Israel. But if they have the capacity to utilize all these ballistic missiles they supposedly have, tied in with Iran, tied in with Yemen, and then the Iraqis and the Syrians kick in what they can with their drones, and then of course Hamas and PIJ are firing rockets out of Gaza because they still can do that. Not a lot, but they still can do it. Yeah, you're going to have a really terrible night, a really terrible week, a really terrible month, however long they want to extend that to for Israel, because at some point they're going to run out of inventory of interceptors. And it's not a question of just, the United States will fund it. We'll just put don't worry, Israel, like we did with the Iraq war, the Afghan war, everything else. We'll just put it on the credit card. We're not, we don't even care about it. No, you can't build the things. It's just that simple. So
then we'll have the threat or the risk, rather, the temptation to take them out of our wartime stock, because we do have them. But then we literally put our national security at risk, and I bet there's some that are willing to think about that. But anyway, we'll see where that goes. Listen,
I was going to say, it reminds me, we have so much here still, like in the sense of the number of batteries, that Patriot batteries we have sent to Ukraine, I think is less than 10. And meanwhile, we have at least 100 batteries here in the United States. It's the same with the tanks, with the Abrams tanks. We rebuilt or whatever we did to send them 40 M1A1s. And in the meantime, the Marine Corps just retired 250 or so M1A2s. They're all sitting out in Barstow, California, probably. Why didn't we give them then? And I'm reminded of a Louis C.K. bit where he talks about how he tells his little girls there's no ice cream in the refrigerator. And the reality is that the freezer is stocked with ice cream, but they're not tall enough to see into it, kind of thing. He talks about like their heartbreak, how this will ruin his relationship with them for life. And that's how the Ukrainians should be. You guys are telling us you can't give us the stuff, and it's all sitting there. All those M1 tanks are sitting in California or in Georgia or wherever the Marine Corps stored them. Why don't you?
The issue with the Patriots, though, is that we may have the batteries, but we don't have the interceptors.
We don't have exactly. That's
a big problem with that.
Yeah.
Listen, in the last amount of time we have here, I want to, since we were talking about stuff in the Middle East here, I want to get your commentary and your observation and your thoughts on an interview I saw from, I think it was yesterday, with Christiane Amanpour interviewing the Lebanese foreign minister. And in the middle of this interview, she's going to ask a question. He's going to start to answer it. She's going to stop him in the middle and say, wait. Do I understand what you're saying correctly? Did you just say this here? And he repeats it. And what he says here is, to me, was very, very illuminating and eye-opening on just how serious this situation is in the Middle East, and how Israel has not only no interest in peace, but they're physically, actively subverting it. Watch this.
Are you saying Hassan Nasrallah had agreed to a ceasefire just moments before he was assassinated?
He agreed, yes. Yes, we agreed completely. Lebanon agreed to ceasefire, but consulting with the Hezbollah, the speaker, Mr. Berry, consulted with Hezbollah, and we informed the Americans and the French that what happened.
So,
And they told us that Mr. Netanyahu also agreed on the statement that was issued by both presidents.
okay, well, as you know, Mr. Netanyahu was also in New York at the time, and he actually said publicly the IDF must fight on. And then he ordered the assassination and the targeting of that headquarters, which killed Nasrallah. So, given all of that, I mean, who do you have any faith in if the strongest country in the world, the United States, seems to have no or very little influence after publicly saying that there would be a ceasefire?
I don't think we have an alternative. Yes.
That was just astounding to me that we agreed that there would be a ceasefire, that we apparently Netanyahu agreed, and that then again, apparently, according to this, what he said, what some others have reported, that Nasrallah went into his bunker to work with his commanders on working out the deals of the ceasefire, and then Netanyahu gave the order to take them out. And I want you to talk about two separate things here. Just one about the what was reported there at all, and then second, the last part of what he said about the trust issue. I'll come back to that in a second. Hit the first one there first.
This matches up with what we know, because when Netanyahu was coming to the United States last Thursday, the reports in the media were that the reports coming from the Americans were that they had worked with the Israelis for a ceasefire in Lebanon and that they were working on the details. So that matches up very much with what the Lebanese prime minister is saying there, that Nasrallah had, in what you're reporting, Danny, that Nasrallah and his lieutenants were in the process of trying to come to a ceasefire deal. And then, of course, Netanyahu arrives in New York and says, no, that's not what we're going to do. And then, of course, the attacks occur. So there may have been a few hours of daylight there where Hezbollah would have realized there is no prospect of a ceasefire. Certainly doesn't forgive the Hezbollah for not remaining in not fully protecting themselves. Although I think the idea that somehow Israel was going to launch those types of strikes in Dahia and flatten residential buildings as Netanyahu is standing at the podium at the UN declaring his desire for peace, because that's how he began that speech. I think that is so fantastical, such an insane proposition, even though it lines up with how Israel actually is, that maybe that's why Hezbollah I wouldn't say they had their guard down. I don't think Nasrallah was sitting in his living room, watching a soccer match, eating pizza or something like that. But, certainly they would have been more dispersed. They would have probably cut their communications back quite a bit. They would have really gone to the ground and prepared for, they were already in a war mentality, but I think people understand what I'm saying. It would have been further than that if it was clear to them that there was no prospect of a ceasefire. And the problem is, as you're talking about, it's not the Israelis who are the villains in the story. It's the Americans who are the villains in the story, because the Americans are the ones who were telling the world, including the Lebanese and Hezbollah, that Israel has worked with this. We just got to get the details down, but Israel is in line with us for a ceasefire deal, which anyone paying attention to last year should have known. This is just Charlie Brown and Lucy with the football, But, so I think that type of who the villain in the story is the United States. And if you see reporting from Politico on Monday, they had a big story talking about how Brett McGurk, who is the White House senior advisor for the Middle East, and Amos Hochstein, who is a senior advisor for Israel and Palestine, basically have been walking around telling the Israelis, we want you to invade Lebanon. We're saying one thing over here publicly, but behind the scenes, supposedly McGurk and Hochstein are telling the Israelis, go do your invasion, go do your attacks. We're behind you on this. And there's an incredible quote in that story where it basically says that where McGurk and Hochstein are saying that an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which would lead to the destruction of Hezbollah, would remake the Middle East for the better for years to come. This incredibly fantastical, delusional quote in there. But that, I think, adequately and accurately describes who these people are, who McCurk and Huckstein and Sullivan and Blinken and ultimately Biden actually are. Yeah, that's the story. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, and that that's what got my attention. It's just almost like a gut punch that you cannot be serious that you actually think that.
Right.
I mean, we've been talking like here for weeks about the possibility of Israel going in on the ground in Lebanon and how hard that of a military task that is. And now we're seeing it graphically play out after barely 36 hours into that. They're all of a sudden suffering huge casualties that even the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, has admitted to, which surprised me. But now I wonder if Biden is getting any buyer's remorse from listening to these guys, because you're talking about making it for the better. Israel might not even survive this. What are you talking about? Remake the Middle East? That's just insane.
Right. And people thought Jared Kushner was mad when he was in charge of Middle East policy for the Trump administration. Right. You know, and this is just a different form of madness. This is just a different you know, and as you said, Israel has launched raids into Lebanon, and they've carried out their those raids resulted in a very ugly, bloody nose. Certainly not anything that you know, in terms of numbers that matters to the Israeli military, but in terms of optics, it certainly does. So Israel's been talking about going back into Lebanon for, as you said, weeks now. Certainly the history of Israel going into Lebanon, all that context. And the first combat between Israel and Hezbollah, certainly the optics make it look like Israel lost. I mean, they lost 8 young men. You can't, my heart breaks for those young men, for their families, because what did they die for? Those young men should have lived lives, could have done literally almost anything else in their life than that, right? And so my heart breaks for those young men who died there, because it's just so worthless and ultimately serving what purposes. But, you know, the thing about it, though, is the video that comes out of it, the first video of Israel's combat operations on the ground in Lebanon, the first video, Danny, are their kids carrying other kids on stretchers to medevac them out, right? And in the second video of the ground combat operations are those medevac helicopters landing at hospitals. So that's what the Israeli public gets the day after having taken all those ballistic missile strikes. And anyone with a brain in Israel knows that those strikes were they hit their targets. Whether or not they caused any damage, who knows? We'll ever know. You got to assume on the Israeli air bases, those aircraft were up in the air, or they were in their hardened bunker. Certainly, all the troops would have been bunkers themselves. They had hours to prepare for this, so likely there won't be those types of casualties. But the fact that they hit them, and again, back to what we said before, that was a limited strike by Iran. What happens when they bring in their allies and they launch a real strike? You know, as well as too, any Israel really watching this is just like, well, you know what? That could have been my apartment building. That could have been my house. That could have been my kid's school. We are not protected here. And then the next day, the video, as well as they had a terrorist shooting at a bus stop, right, in Jaffa, right? I mean, and then the missile strikes, and then now hey, our boys went into Lebanon, and what's the video coming out of that? Them getting carried out in stretchers, you know. So it's, but you know, this is Israel is a nation that was founded in war, founded in violence, and I think, unfortunately, until there's a generational change, that is the only reality that Israel will know is war and violence.
Yeah, and sometimes that can cure you of that when things go sideways, but we'll have to wait and see. Listen, really appreciate you coming on today, Matt. It's always a pleasure to have you weigh in on these things and giving our deep dive audience the truth and the bottom line. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Danny.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.